The sun hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the desolate landscape. Humanity had long been under the shadow of a catastrophe, the world teetering on the edge of destruction. It had been nearly a decade since the virus that turned the living into mindless, flesh-hungry creatures spread like wildfire across the globe. But in this small corner of what remained of civilization, a group of survivors dared to hope. In the heart of what was once a bustling city, now reduced to ruins, a fortified compound stood as the last bastion of human resistance. Inside its walls, the survivors lived in a fragile peace, their lives a careful balance of survival and rebuilding. The leader of this enclave, Sarah Caldwell, surveyed the horizon, her sharp eyes scanning for any sign of danger. She was a woman of action, no stranger to the brutality of the world outside, and she had kept the compound safe from countless attacks. But something in the air felt different today. The wind carried a strange, unsettling chill, and Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was coming, a storm they were not ready for. Inside the compound, the survivors were busy with their routines. A small group was scavenging for supplies, others were tending to the crops that had become their lifeline, while the rest kept watch. Among them was Eli Turner, a young, impulsive man who had joined the enclave only a few months earlier. His determination to prove himself was palpable, but so was his recklessness. He had a knack for getting into trouble, something Sarah was all too aware of. Eli was out on a routine scavenging mission with a small group, pushing past the wreckage of what used to be a shopping mall. The silence around them was suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of crumbling buildings and the occasional flurry of birds taking flight. They had learned to listen to the world, to feel the pulse of danger before it arrived. But today that pulse was muted, and they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As they ventured deeper into the ruins, Eli's mind wandered, thinking of the life that had been stolen from them, the normalcy of days long gone. A flash of movement caught his eye, and he immediately held up a hand, signaling for the others to stop. His heart raced, but there was nothing to see. He was about to dismiss it as nothing more than nerves when a sudden scream echoed through the air. It wasn't human. The sound was primal, guttural, a terrifying reminder of what lurked just beyond the veil of civilization. Eli's eyes widened in horror. His worst fears were coming true. The undead were here, closer than they had ever been before. Without warning, a dozen of them emerged from the shadows, their eyes vacant, their limbs stiff and jerky. They moved with unnatural speed, their mouths dripping with a hunger that could never be satisfied. Eli and his group reacted instinctively, grabbing their weapons and scrambling for cover. But it was too late. The undead were already upon them. A battle ensued, chaotic, bloody, and desperate. Eli fought with everything he had, using a crowbar to smash the skull of one of the creatures, while another lunged at him from behind. He barely managed to dodge, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to regroup with the others. But the undead were relentless, moving in swarms that seemed to multiply with every passing second. Eli's mind raced, trying to recall the training he had received in the compound. They needed to retreat, and they needed to do it fast. He shouted to the others, urging them to fall back to the safer zone. But in the chaos, one of his comrades, a woman named Rachel, was grabbed by one of the undead. Her screams were cut short as the creature sank its teeth into her throat. Eli froze for a moment, his heart sinking, but there was no time for hesitation. With one last, desperate glance at the fallen woman, he turned and ran, leading the rest of the group back toward the compound's perimeter. As they neared the gates, Eli's mind raced. How had the undead found them so quickly? This was unlike anything they had faced before. It was as if the creatures had been waiting, lying in wait for the perfect moment to strike. The gates slammed shut behind them just as the undead reached the wall, their gnashing teeth and ragged moans echoing in the air. But as Sarah Caldwell observed from the safety of the compound, she knew this was only the beginning. The undead were evolving, becoming smarter, more dangerous. and the fight for humanity's survival was about to enter its most brutal phase. The compound was on high alert. The gates were tightly shut, and armed guards stood watch atop the high walls, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Inside, the survivors huddled in tense silence. The fight outside had been brief but brutal. The undead had been relentless, and the sheer number of them was unlike anything they had encountered before. It was clear that this attack was only the beginning of something far more ominous. Sarah Caldwell paced the command center, her mind racing. The undead were no longer just mindless creatures. They were organized. Something had changed. It wasn't just a random group of zombies wandering the ruins. This attack had been too coordinated. Her gut told her that there was a new intelligence behind the horde, and she wasn't sure whether it was a terrifying evolution of the virus or something far worse. The thought made her skin crawl. Eli, breathless and covered in blood, had barely made it inside with the rest of his team. His heart was still racing, his adrenaline pumping through his veins. But as soon as they were safely behind the walls, his thoughts turned to Rachel. She had been taken by the undead, her screams echoing in his mind. The image of her twisted body being dragged away gnawed at him. He knew it was foolish to dwell on it. In this new world, survival was all that mattered, but he couldn't shake the guilt. "Sarah," Eli said as he approached the leader, his voice tight with frustration. "We need to go back out there. We can't leave them." "Rachel, we don't have time for that." Sarah cut him off, her voice firm but not unkind. "We need to figure out what we're dealing with." That was too coordinated to be a coincidence. The undead aren't just wandering aimlessly anymore. They're coming after us for a reason. Eli's face twisted in anger, but he knew better than to argue. Sarah had kept them alive all these years, and her instincts had proven sharper than anyone's. But the loss still weighed heavily on him. The whole compound could feel it, an unsettling dread that clung to the air. The undead were no longer just the mindless hordes of the past. They were evolving, and their intentions were becoming clear. The fight for humanity's future was only just beginning. The next few days were filled with tense preparation. Sarah ordered the survivors to reinforce the walls, stockpile as many supplies as possible, and prepare for a long siege. But the uncertainty hung like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. No one could predict what would happen next. Late one night, as Sarah and her trusted lieutenant, Lucas, reviewed plans for the next phase of defense, a series of loud bangs echoed from the gates. The sound was unmistakable. Something was trying to break in. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The undead were back. But this time, something felt different. "We need to see what's going on," Sarah said urgently, grabbing her rifle. Lucas followed close behind, both of them moving swiftly toward the gates. The sound of relentless pounding continued as they reached the outer wall. Peering over the barricades, they could see a group of undead clawing and gnashing at the gates. But something was off. They weren't just trying to break through. They were waiting. Their movements were synchronized, almost methodical, as if they had learned how to coordinate their attack. Sarah's mind raced, and the realization hit her with cold clarity. They were being tested. The undead were probing for weaknesses, learning from every attempt. The fear was palpable among the survivors, but Sarah's resolve only hardened. "We can't let them break through. Not now, not ever," she muttered under her breath. She turned to Lucas, her face set in grim determination. "Prepare the team. We need to get out there tomorrow. Find the source of this evolution." Before Lucas could respond, a low, guttural growl erupted from the back of the compound. It wasn't the sound of one undead. It was the sound of many, and it was getting closer. Sarah's heart skipped again. "Not again," she whispered. Suddenly, the ground shook as if something massive was moving just beneath their feet. The undead weren't just attacking. They were preparing for something more catastrophic. It was no longer about survival. It was about understanding how and why the undead were changing, and whether humanity had a fighting chance against it. The group rushed toward the back of the compound, and what they saw took their breath away. A massive, towering figure, unlike anything they had ever seen, stood looming over the walls. It was one of them, but its size was monstrous. It moved with a terrifying sense of purpose, its eyes glowing an unnatural shade of yellow. And it was leading the attack. "It's not just a zombie," Lucas muttered, his voice trembling with fear. "It's something else." The beast, this new breed of undead, let out a blood-curdling roar, signaling the horde behind it to charge. The survivors watched in stunned silence, realizing they were facing something far worse than they could have imagined. The war for humanity's future had just begun, and the stakes had never been higher. The night air was thick with tension. The massive undead creature, its hulking form casting a long shadow against the compound walls, let out another deafening roar. The ground shook with each step it took. The survivors, still in shock from the sight of the creature, scrambled to take positions, weapons at the ready. This was unlike anything they had encountered before. The horde of undead that had once been a chaotic swarm of mindless predators had now coalesced into something far more dangerous, something with leadership. "Get to the armory," Sarah barked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. She motioned for Eli and Lucas to follow her. "We need to defend this place, but we also need answers. Whatever that thing is, it's not a typical zombie. We need to figure out how to stop it before it tears this compound down." Eli nodded but couldn't tear his eyes away from the beast that led the assault. Its yellow eyes glowed with a predatory intelligence that sent a shiver down his spine. He had fought the undead before, many times, but this was different. The creature wasn't just a monster, it was a leader, and it was teaching the horde how to strike with purpose. The survivors quickly fortified their positions. Sarah, Eli, and Lucas made their way to the armory, where the sounds of the undead growing closer reverberated through the compound. Each minute that passed made their chances of survival feel slimmer. Inside the armory, Sarah grabbed a heavy rifle, checking its chamber, and passed weapons to the others. "We have enough to hold them off for a while. But we can't keep doing this forever," she said, her voice tight. "We need to find out how to deal with that creature. It's not a random mutation. It's a signal. The undead are evolving, and we're in the way." Eli's jaw clenched as he loaded his rifle. He had seen the look of defeat in the eyes of some of the survivors when the horde first arrived. But there was something inside him that refused to give up. Rachel had been lost, but there were others to protect. He couldn't let the undead win. Not now. Outside, the chaos intensified. The massive undead creature slammed into the gates, causing them to groan under the pressure. The smaller undead continued to claw and bite at the walls, trying to find a weakness, but it was the towering figure that commanded the assault. Suddenly, the gates shuddered violently as the massive creature delivered another blow. This time, the gate cracked, splintering under the sheer force. The sound was bone-chilling, and the survivors knew they couldn't wait much longer. "We have to hold them off," Sarah said, her eyes burning with fierce determination. "Lucas, get the others in position. Eli, you're with me. We're going out there." Eli was about to protest, but the look in Sarah's eyes silenced him. There was no time for second-guessing. They needed to act, and they needed to act fast. With a deep breath, they'd made their way back to the outer wall, where the reinforced barricades were holding for the moment. The massive creature was circling the gates like a predator sizing up its prey. Its body was covered in the tattered remnants of flesh, but its eyes, the intelligence within them, was what terrified Eli the most. "What the hell is that thing?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her eyes narrowed. "But we're about to find out." As they neared the gates, Sarah raised her hand, signaling for the group to halt. She was trying to formulate a plan, but time was running out. The creature's growls grew louder, its monstrous hands gripping the gates with terrifying strength. The horde behind it roared in unison, as though sensing the impending collapse. Without warning, the gates gave way. The massive creature tore through the barricade, sending splinters flying in all directions. The survivors opened fire, but their bullets seemed to have little effect on the beast's thick, decaying hide. "Fall back," Sarah shouted. "Fall back to the inner courtyard. We need to regroup." The survivors scrambled to retreat, but the creature's advance was swift and brutal. It moved with terrifying speed, despite its grotesque size. The horde surged forward, following their leader without question. It was like they were under some dark command. As they retreated into the compound's inner courtyard, Sarah's mind raced. There had to be a way to stop this creature, this leader of the undead. They couldn't rely on firepower alone. Something else was at play here. "Eli," Sarah said, her voice urgent, "I need you to go back to the old research lab. It's a long shot, but we might find something there, something that can help us understand what's happening." Eli nodded without hesitation. "I'm on it." He dashed through the compound, weaving between barricades, narrowly avoiding the attacks of the undead that had breached the outer gates. The research lab was located beneath the remnants of an old hospital, a place Sarah had once used as a refuge when the outbreak had first begun. But now it was a potential treasure trove of forgotten science, hidden knowledge that might hold the key to surviving the new breed of undead. As Eli reached the lab entrance, he shoved the rusted door open, stepping into the dark, musty space. Dust particles danced in the weak light filtering through broken windows. The lab was silent, abandoned, but there were files scattered across tables, faded but legible. Eli's heart pounded as he frantically sifted through the research, praying that something would jump out at him. Suddenly, he came across a folder labeled Project X, Evolution of the Infected. With shaking hands, he opened it. The files detail a secret military experiment, one that had aimed to enhance the undead for combat purposes. The experiment had been shut down, but the files showed evidence of one particular specimen, the one now leading the horde. Eli's stomach churned as he realized the truth. The creature wasn't just an evolved zombie. It was the result of human manipulation, a monstrosity created for war, and it was the key to everything that had happened to the world. Eli stood in the dim light of the old research lab, the folder in his hands trembling as he absorbed the shocking revelation. The creature leading the undead horde wasn't just a freak mutation or random outbreak. It was the result of a top-secret military experiment gone horribly wrong. An experiment designed to turn the undead into a weapon of war. The research files, though incomplete, showed that the creature's intelligence wasn't an anomaly. It had been engineered. The truth hit Eli like a wave. This was no longer just about surviving an apocalypse. It was about stopping a weaponized force that could very well be the end of humanity. Eli's breath quickened as he skimmed the pages, trying to find something, anything, that could help. The project had been abandoned when the virus spread too far, but the final entry in the folder caught his eye. Subject X, Reversion Protocol. In case of global failure, neutralization of infected leadership could prevent a global takeover. It was vague, but it was something. A potential way to stop the creature. Eli's mind raced. The creature wasn't just a leader of the undead. It had been intentionally created to lead them, to give them structure, direction, and purpose. And if it was destroyed, the horde might disband. If they had any hope of fighting back, they had to take down the creature, and fast. Eli's heart pounded as he slammed the folder shut, rushing to the compound's exit. He knew what had to be done. He needed to get back to Sarah with this information. But getting there wouldn't be easy. The undead were already overwhelming the inner courtyard, and the massive creature was still at the forefront, leading the charge. Meanwhile, Sarah had taken charge of organizing the remaining survivors in the courtyard, trying to strategize their final defense. The outer walls had been breached, and the undead were now pouring in from all directions. The once safe haven was becoming a death trap, and the survivors were running out of options. They couldn't rely on sheer firepower anymore. They had to stop the creature. Lucas stood at Sarah's side, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Sarah, We can't hold them much longer. We need a plan. I know, Sarah said, her voice tight with the weight of their situation. But we're not going down without a fight. We've lasted this long. We'll find a way. Just as Sarah turned to give orders, Eli burst into the courtyard, breathless and wide-eyed. Sarah, I found something. We can stop it. We can stop them. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she took in his urgent expression. What are you talking about? Eli held up the research folder. That creature, it's not just a mutation. It's a weapon. A military experiment gone wrong. But there's a protocol in the files, something about neutralizing the leadership. If we take down the creature, the rest of the horde could fall apart. Neutralize the leader, Sarah repeated, her mind racing. How do we do that? Eli nodded, his hands trembling as he spoke. It's unclear, but it seems to be linked to its brain chemistry. There might be a way to disrupt its connection to the horde. An EMP, maybe, or some sort of neurotoxin. But we'll need to find a way to get close to it. Sarah didn't hesitate. We don't have time to waste. If we can get close enough to that thing, we'll take it out. We have one shot at this. The plan was simple, but fraught with peril. The compound was already overrun, and the massive creature was wreaking havoc. There was no room for mistakes. Sarah gathered a small team of the best fighters, Eli, Lucas, and a few others, and made her way toward the heart of the compound, where the creature stood towering over the horde, its yellow eyes glowing with sinister intelligence. The survivors moved swiftly through the chaos, dodging undead and using every weapon at their disposal to clear a path. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of decay. Every step felt like an eternity. They reached the creature. It was more horrifying up close, its body a grotesque fusion of human and undead, its muscles bulging, its skin stretched tight over a frame that should have never been able to walk. But it moved with terrifying speed, its eyes locked on Sarah and her team as it let out another deafening roar. Now, Sarah shouted, and the team opened fire. The bullets had little effect on the creature's thick hide, but the distraction was enough to give them a chance to get closer. Eli's mind raced. He knew they had only moments before the horde descended on them completely. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the future of humanity depending on their ability to stop this creature. I've got an idea, Eli muttered, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. There was a pile of old equipment nearby, abandoned from the early days of the outbreak. He dashed toward it, grabbing an old generator and wiring it into a crude electrical system. Cover me, he yelled, as Sarah and the others fired on the creature to draw its attention. With shaking hands, Eli connected the wires, hoping that his makeshift device would work. He had no idea if it would, but it was their last hope. As he flipped the switch, a surge of electricity shot through the wires and into the generator. The creature roared in pain, its body convulsing as the electrical pulse hit its brain. For a moment, the creature froze. Its eyes glazed over, and the horde around it hesitated, confused. Then, like a domino effect, the undead around them began to collapse, their bodies ceasing to move. The once structured horde fell into chaos. The creature, now incapacitated by the electric pulse, staggered backward and crumpled to the ground. It was over. The horde disbanded, their connection to their leader severed. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The compound was still standing. Barely, but they had won. The future of humanity, fragile and uncertain, was still alive. As the survivors gathered to mourn their losses and rebuild, they knew that the world would never be the same. The undead were no longer just mindless predators. They had been orchestrated, manipulated, but there was hope. The fight was far from over, but humanity had survived. For now, that was enough. The end. Or is it? Let me know if you need any revisions or want to explore the next steps in this story.